Chapter 8, Section 1. How our thought patterns become our own material realities. Our long-term memories is the largest memory in our brain, as we have already mentioned in many previous chapters, and is why all of the personal information that becomes stored into our long-term memories becomes highly influential and has the capacity to control most of our behaviours, our thought patterns, our decisions, our reasoning, and most of our reactions. And this is how, whenever we are upset, angry, hurt, in fear, suffering, stressed, or having any other of our different ego emotional wounds and suffering, our ego thought patterns rise to the surface in our long-term memories and takes over control of all logical, rational information stored in our long-term memories. And this is when it all starts to go horribly wrong, because, however we may think that we are in control of our ego thought patterns, our ego thoughts are sometimes in control of us, and our ego thought patterns' energy creates our own material realities, matter. This is because we are not yet aware that our personal ego thought patterns project energy, for instance, similar to the invisible energy that connects us to receive signals through our mobile phones. And just like a boomerang, these invisible signals, energy, then returns back to us and into our own material realities, matter. Imagine now if we had all found the practical solutions to dominantly store into our long-term memories our highly evolved altruistic emotions of the collective consciousness. Imagine what our thought patterns would then manifest into our own material realities. This incredible outcome is going to be discussed throughout the second half of this book, section 2. But first, throughout this very small chapter, we are going to discuss through a few very simple theories, as simple as we can possibly make Einstein's theories and other quantum theories, how all energy returns to matter and how all matter returns to energy. Of course, it's a lot more complex than this simplified version above, because this subject is far beyond my own scope of understanding classical and quantum physics. However, having made some extensive practices for many years that allowed me to experience this natural phenomenon, this is how I am quite certain that our own thought patterns' energy returns back to us and into our own material realities, matter. Albert Einstein was born in 1879. He was a German-born theoretical physicist and continues to be acknowledged as one of the greatest classical physicists of all time, and is best known for developing his theory of the law of relativity. But what many of us do not know is that Einstein also made some important findings in the development of theories of quantum mechanics. However, his theory on the law of relativity, mass-energy formula E equals mc squared, all arises from his work through classical physics. But around that same time as Einstein's theories concerning the law of relativity began to appear in the early 1900s, some further experiments were also made by Einstein and some of his colleagues that became the beginning of some important findings concerning quantum theories, as you will discover shortly. This is why, throughout this chapter, we are going to try to explain how these complex theories occurred, because as we all know, that the law of relativity is an extremely difficult set of mathematical equations, and personally I have to admit that this is not one of my own scientific fields of study, just the same as neuroanatomy and neuroscience is not. Therefore, I am attempting to back up my own findings and theories through these highly acclaimed independent science experts' research studies. However, it must be noted that classical physics and quantum physics are two entirely different discussions. This is why all links to many of these independent scientific research studies can be found in the index at the back of this book. But it is extremely important that we complete these discussions because currently we have no idea that we are all holding ourselves back from discovering a life that is full of a heightened sense of wellness, blissful happiness and healing within ourselves, and also a life of collective happiness, harmony and peace with each other, simply because we are not yet aware that our thought patterns, energy, creates our own material realities, matter. This is why I am utterly confident that we must all be very careful of our own individual thought patterns. Because whatever we think returns back to us and into our own material realities. This is why every day before I found solutions to release and heal my own set of ego behavioural patterns, I became very mindful of my thoughts, because I knew that sometimes my own set of ego behavioural patterns were trying really hard to take over control in my long-term memory, and therefore were also trying really hard to create my own material realities. For example, whenever I was faced with difficult face-to-face ego interactions with difficult people, or whenever I was receiving difficult fear-based information through social media, media news, email scams, etc., or even through my own difficult ego fears, ego anxieties, or ego stresses that became triggered for many different reasons, such as money issues, for example. This is when my own ego fear or hurt emotions would try really hard to take over control of all other logical, rational thought patterns stored in my long-term memory. This is when my ego thought patterns would begin to project an energy, and this energy would then materialize into my own material realities. Also, all of these new ego emotions would also become stored into my own long-term memory. So how did this happen? When we have a thought, any thought, our thought is based on the personal information that is stored in our long-term memories. And many of our thoughts usually accompany an emotion. We can try this easily ourselves through picking a memory, any memory that comes into our heads, and see how this makes us feel, good or bad, happy or sad. This is why we should all make the most of our lives and stop dwelling on the most serious issues that most of us pay too much attention to. For example, worrying about trying to gather as much money or material possessions as we can throughout our lives. Because material possessions don't last forever. However, good, happy and loving kind memories do last forever, but only through good, happy and loving kind emotional events. But many of us spend our entire lives working hard in full-time jobs that many of us don't like, just to earn money to pay our mortgages for our homes, for instance. Because we worry about our individual security for our future. However, when we finally get to retirement, many of us don't even understand how to enjoy our lives because we are now too old for our memories to begin understanding how to enjoy life. This is because, as mentioned many times throughout this book, whatever has been stored into our long-term memory is who we become. And this relates to many of our different personal worries, such as our personal health worries, relationship worries, worries of loss of love, loss of job, financial worries, all different kinds of anxieties or worries that we all accumulate and store into our long-term memories. So let's now return back to the science that explains how our own ego thought patterns create our own material realities. Because without a scientific explanation, no person will ever take this information seriously. Therefore, we are going to discuss through some very basic explanations of Einstein's theory of relativity that even today are undeniably the most accurate explanation of how energy changes to matter, and how other research found through some of Albert Einstein's, Niels Bohr and Planck's very important experiments, such as the double-slit experiments, have provided us all with an accurate explanation for some of our more modern quantum theories today. But these theories, found through the law of relativity discovered through Einstein's work in classical physics, are extremely difficult to explain because they are based on understanding complex scientific mathematical equations. This is why we are not going to give any complex scientific mathematical equations, but instead give a few step-by-step basic principles that may help to describe how energy transforms to matter and how matter transforms to energy. Atoms were discussed by Greek philosophers dating back as early as Empedocles, around 450 BC, who proposed that there were 4 elements, earth, air, fire and water, which in various proportions constituted matter, and this brought an atomic theory of matter to be proposed in 478 BC by a Greek philosopher, Leucippus. However, it is said that this theory was first derived from his student Democritus, who began his studies in 420 BC and maintained that all materials in the world were made of atoms, and that atoms were supposed to be in random perpetual motion in a void, that is, in nothingness. There were many other theories in between these earlier dates. However, the next great thinker regarding the theory of atoms took place in the late 17th century, when Isaac Newton based his theories that the universe was made up of what was believed at the time to be solid objects, atoms, attracted towards each other by gravity. In other words, Newton believed that atoms were made up of solid nature, electrons and protons, and each atom consisted of a solid mass or solid physical object. When Einstein began his scientific studies in the early 1920s, he went on one step further to prove that atoms could be broken down and analysed into subatomic particles, and that these subatomic particles were made up of pure energy. In other words, from the macroscopic to the microscopic, everything that exists within the 5 physical senses, touch, taste, smell, sight, hearing, these energies were attracted together by way of gravity. All energy is attracted together by way of gravity. But as you will discover shortly, this was not all that Einstein discovered in his theories through the law of relativity. However, below you will find Einstein's formula that has gone down as one of the greatest scientific discoveries throughout history. E equals mc squared. Cosmos relates to universe. Universe relates to galaxy. Galaxy relates to the earth. The earth relates to individuals. Individuals relates to organ systems. Organ systems relate to cells. Cells relate to molecules. Molecules relate to atoms. And atoms relate to subatomic particles, equals energy. What Einstein discovered is that all things broken down to the most basic structure were made up of pure energy, and this energy makes up absolutely everything, dead or alive, all that belongs to our earth, our universe, our cosmos. So first, we have to begin to acknowledge that all matter of any sort is simply made up of energy, pure energy, within us, within our hearts, within our souls, within our emotions, within our thoughts. It's an energy, it's just energy. And all that belongs to our earth and our universe is made up of energy. The trees, our homes, the pebbles on the beach are made up of energy. For example, energy created men to connect with women, to create new life, matter. Trees and plants, vegetables and fruits are created through photosynthesis, that is energy, and energy through photosynthesis is used to grow and produce roots and develop leaves and the flowers and evolve into fruits and vegetables, matter. Stones and rocks evolve from energy, from the Earth's crust, evolving through billions of years of minute minerals and gas particles, energy, held together through gravity, matter. The wooden chairs you sit on are created from trees that grew through the complex process of photosynthesis, energy, and through growth, a tree emerged, matter. If you are sitting on plastic chairs or having plastic consumer products, all plastic was created from processing certain natural and chemical compounds, mostly crude oils, being positively charged together, energy, that created plastic materials, objects, matter. Our mobile phones, laptops and computers are all run by invisible internet currents of energy that connect invisible satellite signals that allow us to connect through all of our different modern digital technologies and to communicate with each other and to work and find information on our different digital devices, matter. All electricity flows through currents or waves of energy that transforms into our lighting, heating our cookers and our landlines for our computers, mobiles and all electrical appliances that we use today, matter. And all energy sources, such as natural gas, began life as energy, compressed gas, energy, that has been trapped down and deep inside our earth for millions of years, but once this natural gas is lit by a flame, it turns into matter for many of our heating and cooking needs. And the same for coal and crude oil, for instance, that are natural earth elements that have taken millions of years to compress down to create natural earth's resources, matter. And once coal is burnt, it gives off an energy that can be used for creating our electricity or energy needed to heat furnaces to extremely high temperatures for steel production, glass production, solar panel production, etc. Matter. You evolve from energy. Your DNA developed genetic forces at embryo level, energy, that began to evolve and grow your body and brain as a human baby, and continues to grow and develop you throughout your childhood and into your adulthood, matter, and will continue even into your old age, matter, until you return to energy again, However, that's another story for another day. When I began writing this book, I also began creating an energy that I hope will one day evolve into a brand new set of positive and peaceful, advanced, collective material outcomes for all of our lives and for the collective life of all that belongs to our vulnerable and fragile planet Earth, matter. As a baby, you involuntarily developed emotions, energy, that began to create new neural synapses to form in order to create new neural connections. And hundreds of new neural networks evolved through this process called neuroplasticity that began your own individual emotional growth patterns that developed and were stored into your own long-term memories, that created and constructed your own personal, individual behavioural patterns, thought patterns, reasoning, decisions, and your own individual reactions that are now all part of your own individual personality matter. And this is why we are sometimes not very responsive or not very in control of our own ego thought patterns, especially when we are upset, angry, in fear, hurt, hate, stressed, distrustful, or having any other of our different difficult ego emotional wounds or suffering, energy, because our ego thought patterns take over control of all logical, rational information stored in our long-term memories to send out waves of energy, just like the invisible signals that connect us on our mobile phones. And just like a boomerang, these waves of energy then return back to us and into our own material realities through more of these ego emotions to become stored into our long-term memories, matter. In other words, whenever we are interacting with difficult people, difficult situations, or difficult events, our upset or angry ego thought patterns take over control in our long-term memories and projects our ego thoughts energy that manifests into our own material realities, matter. The following findings that we are going to discuss below are going to be quite difficult for most of us to believe, simply because they have more or less been hushed up by many of our present-day classical physicists, simply because classical physics and quantum mechanics are two totally different theoretical concepts. Nevertheless, many very important experiments that were first discovered in the early 1900s by Albert Einstein, Niels Bohr and Planck, such as the double-slit experiments, are now dismissed by many of our classical physicists today. But these experiments began to provide us with an explanation of some of these more modern theories of quantum mechanics. And this is why I only began to believe in these theories of quantum mechanics only when I began to experience this natural phenomenon myself. Einstein, Niels Bohr and Planck, along with a few other scientists, discovered in these very important experiments called the double-slit experiments that whatever the scientists' thought patterns transmuted the subatomic particles that were being studied. In other words, whatever the scientists were thinking began to take the form of what they were thinking. At the same time, Einstein, Planck and Bohr also discovered that if the scientists studying the energy with a thought or belief of seeing particles, particles were observed. If the scientists studied energy and expected to see waves, waves were observed. However, These important experiments were challenged by quantum physicist Niels Bohr, who discovered that from the macroscopic to the microscopic, everything that exists within the 5 physical senses, touch, taste, smell, sight, hearing, these senses were waves of energies attracted together by way of gravity. In other words, Niels Bohr discovered that energy can also travel in a wave form through wave particles. And as a result of these outstanding discoveries, Niels Bohr found that these subatomic particles consist of waves with which these waves of energy turned into particles mass, based on the individual thoughts and beliefs of the scientist and what the scientist was doing or observing. Many of these experiments gave way to the more modern quantum mechanics theories, because the double-slit experiment was a demonstration that light and matter can display both characteristics of both classical defined waves and particles. And this became the fundamental nature of quantum mechanics phenomenon that was later developed as a theory by David Bohm. As mentioned many times earlier, this is the reason that we must never ever underestimate the power, control and strength of our own set of individual adult ego behavioural patterns, because our ego thought patterns, energy waves, begin to create our own material realities, mass. Although I am not a physicist and I cannot give an adequate scientific explanation of David Bohm's extensive work on quantum theory, I can only describe these experiences myself as a set of coincidences that kept on happening so many times that they could no longer be put down to a simple explanation of coincidences. In other words, after many years of extensive practices that we are going to discuss in the second half of this book, my highly evolved altruistic thought patterns were able to project my thought patterns, and sometimes even before I had even had the thought even enter into my head. And this thought, energy waves, would then return back to me and into my own material realities, mass. And this is how many times I was able to ask for whatever I wanted, and whatever I asked for manifested into material realities. But many of these double-slit experimental theories, and more recently David Bohm's quantum mechanics, still remain hidden today. However, thanks to these great men, we are now able to offer a glimpse into new concepts and new theories such as David Bohm's quantum mechanics and non-locality. But these double-slit scientific experiments that we described above is a very simplified version that Einstein, Planck and Bohr and other colleagues initially discussed many years ago in the 1927 Solvay conference that was perhaps the most important in the history of quantum theory. However, contrary to popular belief, questions of interpretation were not settled at this conference. Instead, a range of sharply conflicting views, ego emotions, were extensively discussed, including de Broglie's pilot wave theory, Bohr and Heisenberg's quantum mechanics, and Schrödinger's wave mechanics. Today, however, there is no longer a dominant interpretation of quantum theory, so it's important, for the sake of all of mankind's collective future, to re-evaluate these historical sources, especially the more recent David Bohm's quantum theories regarding non-locality. This is why we must try to keep this debate open, because many of the reasons that many classical physicists today are not able to come to a rigid hypothesis regarding quantum theories is that classical physicists focus on questions of space-time, the cosmos, gravity, and the speed of light, and that nothing can travel faster than the speed of light, etc. All connected to the macroscopic that could not equate or have any connection to quantum theories, and the microscopic, the subatomic particles and how they can be affected when they are observed. However, one of our greatest quantum physicists, David Bohm, did understand these theories that he discussed in his book, especially in the chapter A Suggested Interpretation of the Quantum Theory in Terms of Hidden Variables 2, by David Bohm, Palmer Physical Laboratory, Princeton University, July 5, 1951. Because David Bohm, with a team of his computational experts, set up the double-slit experiment using complex mathematical computations required to describe Bohm's hidden variables. Bohm's 52 theory worked, and this became the iconic experiment in the interpretation of quantum theory. However, after being shunned by scientific orthodoxy, in other words, ego behaviours, the maverick physicist David Bohm looked to the East for inspiration and found a friend in a man called Krishnamurti, and he even became friends with the Dalai Lama, who, by the way, is fully developed in his long-term memory with his advanced, highly evolved, altruistic emotions. But this is it. These are the greatest secrets that all of mankind has tried to find for thousands of years. Because throughout our human history, most of our ancestors have tried to find these answers only when their long-term memories were fully developed with ego behavioural patterns. But, as you are about to discover in the second half of this book, once we discover the secrets to find purity of mind, that can only be achieved once we have all found the practical solutions to function dominantly in our long-term memories with our highly evolved altruistic emotions. Our highly evolved altruistic thought patterns, energy, can then send invisible signals, just like the signals on our mobile phones. And just like a boomerang, our altruistic thought patterns, energy waves, returns back to us and into our own material realities, mass. This can only be described as the true meaning of enlightenment. But this is not all that we can obtain in our lifetime, because there is a third and ultimate level of emotional adaptation that holds the secrets for us all to connect with the highly intelligent and great universal law of nature. Because once we have found purity of mind, our altruistic thought patterns, energy waves, can ask for whatever we want, and we then begin to receive back and into our own material realities all of the greatest gifts and miracles that all of mankind has tried to find for thousands of years, mass. However, it's very important for us to remember that in order for our own thought patterns to begin receiving communication from the purity and beauty of the great universal law of nature, our thought patterns must first find purity of mind, and we can only achieve this once we are fully developed in our long-term memories with our advanced, highly evolved, altruistic emotions. This is why this above sentence is the greatest message and gift that I can ever give for the future for all of mankind, because this above sentence explains the entire missing pieces that all great gurus have tried to teach us all throughout our human history. And this is why, in the second half of this book, we are going to try to explain how we can all reach this ultimate level of existence. We do not know much about the life of David Bohm, but his explorations led Bohm to propose the quantum potential, which is an underlying field of consciousness that connects us all. But this natural phenomenon is now, today, further described as non-locality. But it is futile to look for explanations using David Bohm's quantum theories, such as non-locality, because if physicists were to try to explain that whatever is in our thought patterns, energy waves, we receive into physical or material form, mass, and sometimes even before we have had the thought enter into our thought patterns, this would end up being an extremely complex and long drawn out mathematical equation. Added to this, there is a part to quantum mechanics and non-locality that is impossible to describe through mathematical equations, because the universal law of nature is far more intelligent and cannot be explained through mathematical equations. Also, unless a person has experienced this natural phenomenon personally, most of us would never believe that this can occur. This is why, so far, no science experts have been able to fathom out these huge complexities concerning the theories of quantum mechanics, although many have tried. Therefore, the following few sentences below are my own findings on this extremely complex subject. However, there will be no mathematical equations given. It is simply supposition and will be explained in much more detail in the final chapters of this book. We know that Einstein first discovered through his incredible law of relativity theories that nothing is faster than the speed of light. I would agree with this, because the speed of light gave rise to all life here on Earth, because light from the sun's rays of light energy and its warmth became the main contributing factor that began the very first simple plant life to evolve here on our Earth approximately 3,000 million years ago, and that light energy from the sun is also the main contributing factor for all new species of life to have evolved here on planet Earth, because the sun's light energy, combined with a few other elements such as water, carbon dioxide and a few mineral elements, gave rise to a complex process called photosynthesis, as you will discover in chapter 9. But all of these above elements all began life as atoms, and all atoms all first began their creation through the great universal law of nature. And even our wonderful planet the Sun also began its creation from atoms. In fact, all planets and stars in our universe all also first began life through atoms, energy, that evolved into planets, matter. And space in our universe is also made up of atoms, energy, all through its creation through the great universal law of nature. And all species of life here on Earth first began life through atoms, energy, and that energy evolved new species to adapt genetic variations into the creation of new species of life, matter. All rocks, stones, animals, and all creatures, plants and trees, the oceans, our Earth's resources, all first began life through atoms, energy, that evolved into the creation of all life here on Earth, matter. And our human bodies accounts for more than 99% atoms, because the four most abundant elements in our human body are made up of hydrogen, oxygen, carbon and nitrogen, because water is the main substance that our bodies are made from, and water is made of oxygen and hydrogen atoms, and our cells in our bodies are made up of molecules, and molecules are a collection of atoms, because the cells in our bodies are made of proteins, and proteins are made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms. In other words, our body is made up of trillions and trillions of atoms. Because within the centre of each cell is DNA and RNA, and they are both incredibly complex molecules. And this is why all life here on Earth has its own set of unique DNA that scientists call its genome. So what if I were to tell you that there is an even greater law in our universe that is far greater and far more intelligent than the law of relativity and all other laws in our universe? Because it created the law of relativity and all other laws in our universe. Because, as mentioned earlier, the great universal law of nature is far more intelligent than any mathematical equation and any laws, because the highly intelligent universal law of nature created all atoms, created all genetics, created all laws, created all humans, created our earth, created all life that belongs to our earth, and all planets, and all that belongs to our universe. But the great universal law of nature didn't just magically create all of this life by waving a magic wand. It cannot do that. It's far more intelligent than magic tricks, because it took trillions and trillions of years for the purities of the universal law of nature to first create atoms, and trillions of years later, energy pressure and forces of trillions and trillions of atoms started the Big Bang, matter. And it took trillions of years later, through forces of energy from gravity, gases, and different mineral particles that, by the way, all started life as atoms, to pull together through gravity energy to cause new planets to evolve, matter. And about 4.5 billion years ago, our own planet Earth began to evolve when the formation of a solar system stabilized energy into its current formation of different planets, matter. Because the forces of our Earth's gravity, energy, pulled different gases and mineral particles, atoms, into its orbit to become the third planet from the Sun in our solar system, matter. However, please note that only once the Sun was in perfect distance to the Earth could the forces of light, energy, from the Sun give rise to photosynthesis, matter. Because this complex process called photosynthesis, that was also, by the way, created by the great universal law of nature, gave rise to the very first, very simple plant life, approximately 3,000 million years ago. And millions of years later, through another force of energy called adaptation, that was also created by the great universal law of nature. This gave rise to the very first, very simple plants, senses, energy, that were forced to adapt to new environments in order to survive by creating new genetic variations, matter. And this is how all of the different classifications of species of life here on Earth all had to adapt to new environments in order to survive. And this is why we are going to describe adaptation through these different classifications in much more detail in the next chapter. This is why adapting to new environments in order to survive is a highly important aspect of survival for all species of life here on Earth. But this adaptation all occurred through genetic variations, Because if a species couldn't adapt, it would simply go extinct. However, as we explained in earlier chapters, all humans, all animals, and all other creatures genetically adapted in order to survive through a force of energy created through their emotions. However, all plant species and all other very simple organisms genetically adapted through a force of energy created through their senses. And this is how all life, every single species of life that has evolved here on Earth and in our universe, and all planets, and all life, including our own human life, relies on forces of energy to continue all life, matter. For instance, the forces of light energy that gave rise to photosynthesis, that gave rise to the very first simple plant life approximately 3,000 million years ago, that gave rise to adaptation to new environments in order to survive through the plant's senses, that gave rise to a new genetic variation, that gave rise to a new plant species to evolve. These are the basic principles for the evolution of all species of life that has evolved here on Earth. Because life here on Earth is constantly having to adapt to new environments in order to survive. Because throughout millions and millions of years, our Earth's environments have been changing and have caused most species to genetically adapt for a few reasons, such as severe changes in climatic conditions, lack of specific food sources available, or for reproduction purposes. These are a few main contributing factors, and we are no exception to this rule, as you will discover in the next few and final chapters of section 1. But this very first, very simple plant life that began to evolve approximately 3,000 million years ago, that kick-started the very first life to begin here on Earth, was just the beginning, because it takes thousands of years for most species of life to adapt to new environments in order to survive, as you will discover in the next chapter. However, none of this would ever have taken place on planet Earth without the perfect distance of the sun's light energy that began photosynthesis. And this is why our very special planet Earth is a very unique planet indeed, because if we hadn't received this very complex natural configuration and forces of energy that our Earth has had with the sun, there would be no life here on planet Earth, including our own human lives. Because the sun gives life to all life here on Earth. For example, if the sun was too far away from the Earth, our Earth would be shrouded in darkness and no life would have begun approximately 3,000 million years ago. And if the sun was too close to the Earth, all life would simply shrivel up and die with extreme heat and no water. We have no idea how unique and special our planet Earth really is, and how incredibly lucky all humans are to have been gone through such amazing evolution. This is why our human lives are extremely special, because so far no astrologers have found any other life forms on any other planets in our universe except for our own planet Earth. Because most planets are simply made up of different gases, rocks and minerals. This is why the great universal law of nature is the greatest law that exists in our universe and governs over all other laws in our universe. Because the great universal law of nature, gave rise to all different forces of energy. For instance, the forces of energy that created atoms, that created the Big Bang, the forces of energy that created tides in our oceans, the forces of energy that creates our Earth to spin, the forces of energy that created gravity, all forces of energy were initially created through the highly intelligent universal law of nature. We must mention, however, that many great scientists, such as David Bohm and many other quantum theorists that discuss non-locality, even today, came to all of these conclusions mostly through complex mathematical equations. But David Bohm's quantum theory made a clear prediction about the non-locality of our world, and to put it into simple words, he said that it is the profound discovery, the interconnectedness of the universe at the fundamental level of quantum. This matter conflicts deeply with the relativity theory that says that the speed of light is limited and that everything is local. Nothing can travel faster than the speed of light. So how could everything be interconnected in the universe? And this is the big contention, that Bohm's theory of hidden variables and that non-locality has been rejected by most classical physicists even today. Many of these quantum theories still remain beyond science, and this is why it's extremely difficult to express these variables in simplistic terms. However, once witnessed, non-locality changes and transforms our thought patterns in ways that in future we will look back on our current existence and wonder how on earth we all managed to live for thousands of years in these restrictive and limiting ego realities. This is why these very important double-slit experiments conducted by Einstein, Planck and Bohr that were first discussed many years ago in the 1927 Solvay Conference and later by David Bohm are vitally important for us to discuss further, for the sake of advancing mankind's positive and peaceful evolution, and that these experiments really do need further discussions, because it is my own belief that it is not the observer that has the ability to change the wave or particles, but it is the thought patterns of the observer. Imagine now if we all began to recognise that we were all created through the great universal law of nature, and we all found the practical solutions to become dominant with our advanced altruistic emotions, so that our altruistic thought patterns achieved purity of mind, so that our pure thoughts, energy waves, could connect with the pure and beautiful universal law of nature, so that one day we could all begin to receive some of the greatest gifts and miracles that all of mankind has tried to find for thousands of years, mass. This is why, in these next few and final chapters for section 1, we are now going to put all of these missing pieces of our human jigsaw puzzle together, because many of us now live in big towns and cities and have lost our connection to our earth. We no longer recognise that we are all earthlings, all created through the great universal law of nature.